Hello again, everybody. This is Rusty, aka William Robinson, aka Dr. Robinson, and I am the Blues Doctor. Thank you for coming to my podcast this week, and we really appreciate those who were with us last week who supported us for that. We had some technical issues, some quality issues perhaps, but I think we've got most of those worked out now. If you see anything that you think is correctable, don't hesitate to let me know, and we'll do our best to fix them. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, ring the bell, share with other people, and comment or make suggestions. We'd love to hear your comments, and I'll see if I can respond to any suggestions you may have. Now, we got a lot of good stuff, so let's get to it. Okay, on to the calendar in music and medicine for the week. There are a few special dates this week in music that I would like to talk about. The first of which is the birthday of George Harrison, which was February 24th, 1943. George, as most people know, was one of the Beatles, perhaps the most important rock and roll band in history. George was a brilliant musician, a brilliant performer, a brilliant guitarist, a brilliant songwriter, and he happened to have both the blessing and the curse to be in a band with probably the two greatest songwriters of the 20th century in John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So, what do you do in that situation? How do you get your ideas heard when you're writing with those two? And it was difficult. George got frustrated at times about that. Even George Martin, their producer, later on said that he didn't pay as much attention to George's compositions as he should have. At any rate, by their last recorded album, which was the Abbey Road album, the best songs on that album easily are George's songs, one of which was Something, and the other one was Here Comes the Sun. Here Comes the Sun, in fact, is the number one downloaded song in the Beatles catalog in the internet era. Then the second date I wanted to talk about a little bit was more current. Roberta Flack died this week, February 25th. Roberta was 88 years old. She had ALS and died of a heart attack. Roberta was an interesting performer. She's certainly very talented, wonderful singer. Like many people, she started singing in church in the South growing up. She worked her way up to the East Coast and started working in clubs and bars, was finally noticed and signed to Atlantic Records, I think initially as a songwriter, but they eventually realized what a good singer she was also and started letting her record songs. Ironically, most of her big hits were written by other people. Roberta had another sort of a blessing and a curse thing kind of going on in that she crossed over into both the R&B genre and pop music genre and had lots of fans in both, although she had critics that suggested she was not an original in either. I'm not sure that I believe that or agree with it. She was just a tremendous singer. She will be missed. Rest in peace, Roberta. And then finally, the third thing. On this date, March 2nd, 1984, was the release of the rockumentary This Is Spinal Tap. This may be the funniest movie in rock and roll history. The movie was produced and directed by Rob Reiner, who is also one of the stars. Had a great ensemble cast in the movie. If you haven't seen it, even if you're not a musician, you should. It's worth your while. And perhaps the most important thing is that there is about to be a remake of Spinal Tap. It's going to be Spinal Tap 2, at least that's the working title right now. And even more important, your humble podcaster is in the movie. Yes, I'm an extra in Spinal Tap 2, and I got to sit in the auditorium while they were recording. We heard the band play. We got to see the stars. It was lots of fun. That movie is supposed to be out later this year, so be sure and try to catch that one also. Okay, now let's move on to the cancer topic of the week. In the news recently, we have a new chair of the Health and Human Services Department in the United States. That's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And one of the things that RFK has talked about has been the utility and safety of vaccines. And I'm not going to get into all of his issues. In fact, I think some of his opinions about vaccines have changed over the last few years. But I'm going to say something about the human papilloma virus vaccine. This vaccine, as probably most of you know, is to prevent infection with the human papillomavirus, particularly infection in the genital tract. And the purpose of that is to prevent cervical cancer. We know that cervical cancer is caused, without question, by infection with the human papillomavirus. I'm going to explain some of the details of that in a minute, but I wanted to let you know what happened recently that prompted me to talk about it today. So, in his confirmation hearing before the Senate, RFK Jr. was asked by a senator, can you confirm the safety of the HPV vaccine? And he wouldn't do it on screen. He refused to say the HPV vaccine is safe. He did say something to the effect of, we think it's effective. It's sort of a bland statement. And I have to say that's wrong. The HPV vaccine is one of the greatest advances in healthcare for women medicine has ever accomplished. And let me just tell you why. Women who get cervical cancer typically do so when they're in their 40s or 50s. In other words, these are not elderly women, they're typically midlife women. And we also know that those women who get cancer in their 40s or 50s probably had pre-invasive cancer or precancerous lesions of the cervix when they're in their 20s and 30s. In other words, it probably takes 10 or 15 years to go from precancerous lesions to truly invasive cancer. Then on top of that, the women who got the precancerous lesions that are going to go on to be cancer, those women with the precancerous lesions in their 20s and 30s were probably infected with HPV in their teens. So that entire process from time of infection to the time when you get cervical cancer is decades, realistically. For the great majority of cases, there's exceptions always, but the great majority of cases, the disease process takes decades. It also is probably related at least a little bit to the time in a woman's life when she is actually infected. In other words, we believe that the closer in life the woman is to when she starts having periods, we call it menarche, that she is infected. In other words, the time when she's exposed to HPV, the closer it is to the time that she started having periods, the more likely she is to develop precancerous and eventually cancerous disease of the cervix. So it's a function of time in a woman's life, the strain of HPV. Some strains of HPV are more lethal than others, are more likely to turn into cancer than others. Now, I want to make sure that I don't overstate that. Not everybody who's infected with HPV is going to go on to get cervical cancer. That's simply not true. In fact, it's only a small number, a small percentage of the people with HPV who will develop cervical cancers, probably just a few percentage points. But we know the reverse is true. If you had cervical cancer, almost 100% of the time you have had human papillomavirus. So the big advantage of the vaccine is it prevents a woman from getting infected at that crucial point in her life when she's vulnerable to being infected with HPV. And in fact, the FDA and virtually every other medical body in existence, including my own professional organization, which is the Society of Gynecologic Oncology, has recommended that not only should young women be vaccinated, but men as well. And the way I pitch it to people is this: how would you like it if you're a guy, you may not even know you have HPV? In other words, you got exposed to somebody who knows when, then you go on to get married, and you give your wife HPV, sexually transmitted, and she goes on to get cervical cancer. How would you feel then? So that's my pitch for both men and women to get vaccinated. And it works. We know for sure that it works. It's worked all over the world. In countries that started vaccinating people routinely before the United States, like Australia, their rate of cervical cancer has dropped 75%. And it's starting to do that in the United States too. We started vaccinating people a little later than did most of the Western world, and we still have a relatively lower implementation rate. In other words, relatively fewer eligible men and women are actually being vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And I'm sure you've heard some of the anti-vaccine issues. This is really not one that should be a problem. Human papillomavirus works, it prevents cervical cancer. This vaccine is safe. There's virtually no serious side effects. And, for people like me who have seen a lot of cervical cancer in their careers, and I was just talking about this the other day with my wife, from where I trained at City of Memphis Hospital, Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and Los Angeles County Hospital in Southern California, I probably have seen as much or more cervical cancer than anybody who's working in this field right now. In my entire career, I've always been associated with indigent hospitals, and unfortunately, cancer of the cervix is closely associated with ethnicity, with socioeconomic status. So we tend to see most of the women with cervical cancer, and death from cervical cancer can truly be horrifying. I've seen it way too many times, and I don't want to ever see it again. So the HPV vaccine is safe, it's effective, and I recommend every one of you all in the audience to have your children vaccinated at the appropriate age, which typically is in the younger teens. Now, I will mention a couple of other controversies with the HPV vaccine. One is that it can be confused with a therapeutic vaccine. In other words, women who are already infected with HPV, in other words, they were exposed, sometime earlier in life, have sometimes had doctors recommend vaccination with the vaccine or being given the vaccine after they've already been infected. And honestly, that doesn't work. Some clinicians, some physicians have been confused about that. This is not a therapeutic vaccine. There are therapeutic vaccines for cervical cancer that are being investigated currently, but that's not what this is. Okay. The other controversial area is vaccination later in life. In other words, what if you, as a woman, were in your 50s and you'd never been exposed to human papillomavirus, which actually is a rarity? Most men and women, adult men and women in the United States, have been exposed to HPV sometime. Most of them don't even know they were exposed. But let's just say a woman in her 50s has not been exposed to HPV, and she gets married in her 50s and asks her physician, should I get vaccinated for HPV? And the answer is, we're not sure. As I said before, cervical cancer is a disease of years to decades. In other words, most women who get cervical cancer were infected with HPV 30 plus years previously. So if you get HPV, if you're infected with HPV in your 50s or later, is that going to be an issue? Is cervical cancer ever going to be a problem for you? Further, you're so far out, a woman in her 50s is so far out from menarche, probably her cervix and vagina are not as vulnerable to the process by which HPV causes cancer as she was when she was in her teens. So, should the HPV vaccine be given later in life to women who have not been exposed? My answer is no. I would not recommend it, but I know there's some controversy about that. I know there is not a consensus among physicians, and I'll leave it at that. Well, let's go back to music for a minute, a lighter topic, maybe lighter. In the musical news of the week, Mick Jagger recently stated to the press that he will not sing and the Rolling Stones will not perform the song Street Fightin' Man anymore. Street Fightin' Man was from 1968. It was one of the Stones' biggest hits. The rationale for not singing it, according to Mick, is that the lyrics were violent, they were of another time, and he just didn't think it was appropriate to sing that song anymore. As you might recall, in 1968, there was a fair amount of violence all over the world, certainly in France, the UK, and in the United States, those of us who are old enough to remember that. And that song reflected that. Street Fighting Man reflected some of that violence. It did not glorify violence, at least not in my opinion. So I was a little disappointed, I guess, that Mick has chosen to do that. They routinely play a lot of different songs out of their catalog, not just the new ones, when they do shows these days. But they're not going to do Street Fighting Man anymore. So that's a little disappointing, I think. And that reminded me that they did this with another song previously, too. You may recall the song Brown Sugar, which was from 1971. Another great song and one of my favorite Stones songs of all time. But the lyrics to Brown Sugar were controversial as well. And Mick announced, I think it was in 2021, that the Stones would no longer perform that song for those reasons. Well, Brown Sugar is about slavery, it's about sex, it's about violence, about violent sex. And Mick felt like it was no longer appropriate to talk about that. I'm not really sure that I understand why that is. It was about historical facts, bad things that happened in the world in centuries past. And I think it is reasonable to use artistic interpretation to make us aware of bad things that have occurred in our past, in human past. I don't understand why we can't talk about those things. So I'm a little disappointed in Mick at the Stones for doing that. Hopefully, it won't happen too much more often. While we're talking about the Rolling Stones, I thought I might use one of their records for my music review of the week. They did an album last year called Hackney Diamonds, which they released as part of their promotional tour that they did all over the world last year. It was very successful. They sold over 1 million copies. The tour was sold out everywhere. It was generally well reviewed critically. Most people thought it was a solid record. I think from my standpoint, it is a standard Rolling Stones record. The single they released from the album was called Angry, and it features a traditional hard driving Keith Richards guitar riff that was very good, I thought. They had several other songs that were interesting also, including one song that had a drum track left over from their recently deceased drummer, Charlie Watts, and they got former bassist Bill Wyman to join in on that one. So they had the original rhythm section from the Rolling Stones playing on another song. Some of the other guests on the album included Lady Gaga and Elton John, and Paul McCartney even played on one track. Perhaps the most interesting track on this album was Rolling Stone Blues. This song was actually written by Muddy Waters, and it was, in fact, the inspiration for the name of the band, the Rolling Stones. The story went something like this. The Stones were in their apartment in London, and they couldn't think of what to call themselves when a copy of Rolling Stone Blues by Muddy Waters was laying on the apartment floor. And Brian Jones, the founder and original member of the Stones, picked it up and said, "Why don't we just call ourselves this?" And it stuck. So they became very much enamored with Muddy Waters. I think you could consider him both a mentor and an inspiration to the Stones. They, in fact, later on, about a year later, went to Chicago on their own dime, just out of the blue, went to Chicago and went to Chess Records, where Muddy Waters was signed to and was performing, because they just wanted to see their idol and meet him. Well, I got there, and it turned out Muddy was actually painting the ceiling of the studio. He wasn't performing that day. You know, that's classic blues man stuff. Just do whatever needs to be done. Any rate, so the Stones met Muddy. He was very gracious to them. He told them good luck. He truly seemed to be pleased that someone had come from across the ocean to see him and tell him how much they loved his music. So that actually went pretty well, I guess. At any rate, the song on this album, Rolling Stone Blues, is a cover of that song. The Stones did it as a pure acoustic blues number. It's very traditional, very straightforward. And if you like that, it's actually very good. So, overall, for Hackney Diamonds, I think my take is it's a solid record. It's well produced. It's got some classic Stones tunes on it. Honestly, it's not going to be all that popular in today's age when guitar music is kind of out of style. So, there you go. Good album. And as you may remember from last week, I have kind of an interest in things that are odd or unusual, or you might term high strangeness. Well, I found one of those items this week. It was in the form of a video that was taken from a train in Colorado. Turns out this train is sort of a tourist train. It's a day trip from the city of Durango, Colorado to Silverton. It's way up in the Colorado mountains. It goes from like a 9,000-foot elevation down to 7,000 feet. Very attractive. I've actually been on that train before. It's very pretty. If you get a chance to go out there, it's worth the ride. At any rate, Someone on the train supposedly saw a Bigfoot walking on the mountain outside of the train and got some video footage of it. Turned out to be about 8 or 10 seconds or so. Supposedly, a few other people on the train saw it, but not everybody. The video was eventually released to the public, and I don't know. I don't think too many serious Bigfoot researchers would give too much credence to this. At first glance, you would say, at least I would say, this is a man in a suit. Now, I don't know who could have staged it. Maybe not the person who took the movie. Maybe it was the railroad trying to drum up interest, to sell tickets. Who knows? At any rate, it's interesting. It actually was filmed in November of 2024, but it's still available on the internet. So if you get a chance, take a look at that also. And that's about all I had for this week. Thank you for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed the podcast this week. I've enjoyed making it. Please share because, like I said, we want to increase our numbers if we possibly can. We've even considered possibly using the Blues Doctor logo on some T-shirts or hats or other things. If you're interested in that, please let me know. Otherwise, my Blues Doctor prescription for the week is listen to the weekly podcast and be nice to each other. See you later.